long before the iron sword or the alphabet, the world was already speaking in empires. From the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Anatolia, kings measured distance not in miles, but in messengers, clay tablets pressed with the language of power. Alliances were written, broken, and rewritten in the same sun-baked script. Behind every greeting hid a demand, behind every gift, a threat. In that narrow space of earth and pride stood one city, Kadesh, whose name would be carved into history. There, two kings would meet with armies of chariots and dreams of eternity. The Late Bronze Age was a time when kings wrote to one another in the language of clay. Across the Near East, from the marshes of the Nile to the mountains of Anatolia, the same wedge-shaped letters carried greetings, threats, and desperate prayers for help. In the archives of Amarna, hundreds of those tablets survive, a chorus of voices calling out to a pharaoh who no longer answered. One of them, from a man named Rib-Hadda, ruler of Byblos, begins almost pleadingly. "Let the king, my lord, know that all my cities have risen against me." He begs for soldiers, for archers, for any sign that Egypt still remembers him. None ever came. Under Akhenaten's strange reign, while temples emptied and the old gods fell silent, Egypt's empire in the north unraveled thread by thread. For the small kingdoms of Syria, Egypt's silence was more dangerous than war. Without her, they stood exposed before the storm rising in the north. Out of the stony highlands of Anatolia came the armies of the Hittites, a people as disciplined as they were relentless. Their king, Suppiluliuma I, turned ambition into policy. He swept through the lands of Mitanni, broke their kings, and remade their cities in his own name. When Carchemish fell, he placed his son Piasili on its throne, binding the trade of the upper Euphrates to Hatti forever. What he built with precision. Ugarit, now his loyal port, sent 500 shekels of gold each year to his treasury. Amuru, once Egypt's friend, sent copper and soldiers instead. And Kadesh, rich, fortified, and seated on the bend of the Orontes, yielded control of the road between north and south, the artery that carried wealth worth 10,000 silver shekels each season. Whoever held Kadesh ruled the Middle Lands. The old order was collapsing, and Suppiluliuma knew it. He made treaties where he could and took what he couldn't. In his chronicles, The Deeds of Suppiluliuma, he boasts, "I conquered the land of Mitanni. I divided it among my sons. None stood against me. To the west, his banners reached the sea. To the south, they cast their shadow over the deserts of Canaan." Egypt, meanwhile, was learning how to stand again. After the heretic's death, generals rather than prophets took power. Horemheb, a soldier king, restored discipline. His successor, Seti I, restored ambition. To him, empire was not a word carved in stone, but a path to be walked again, with spear and chariot if necessary. When Seti marched north, he carried more than banners. He carried memory. He crossed the frontier at Jaru, swept through Gaza, and reached as far as the forests of Lebanon, where cedar scented the air, and the names of Egyptian kings still lingered on old walls. At Kadesh, he met Hittite spears and broke them. For a moment, the old balance was restored. Egypt's sun shone again over the valleys of Syria. But victories at the edge of empire are fragile things. Distance erodes them faster than defeat. Before the decade ended, Hittite banners were flying again above the city's twin gates. Seti returned to Thebes knowing what every conqueror learns in time, that no battle stays won forever. The peace that followed was thin as parchment. Letters passed between Hattusa and Thebes, each side calling the other brother. each knowing that brotherhood ends where ambition begins. Beyond their capitals, Syria watched and waited. Merchants in Amuru traded with both sides. Princes swore loyalty twice in the same season. No city embodied that duplicity better than Kadesh, whose rulers mastered survival through flattery. In the north, Superluliuma's heirs quarreled for his throne. His son Mursili ruled briefly before the crown passed to Muatali, a man less flamboyant but no less dangerous. He understood that war is not only fought with armies, but with patience. Quietly, he gathered the pieces his father had scattered. Under his rule, the Hittite Empire turned its face south again. In Egypt, Seti's son was growing into command. Ramesses was not yet the god his temples would later proclaim. But even in youth, he was restless, ambitious, certain that the gods meant him for more than peace. He had watched his father return from Kadesh with honor, but not with victory. To the son, that would not be enough. Syria felt the pull of two empires tightening around it like a net. Amuru, caught in the middle, wavered. Its ruler, Bentashina, saw which way the wind was blowing and swore allegiance to Muatali. The oath was sealed with a Hittite marriage, the oldest currency in diplomacy. When word reached Egypt, it struck like insult. The defection of Amuru meant more than lost tribute. It meant lost pride. From that act of treachery, a decade of preparation began. Muatali sent envoys to every vassal and ally, calling them to arms. From Arzawa came 3,000 warriors. From Lucca, 1,500. From Carchemish, another 3,000. In all, 16 kingdoms answered, mustering 37,000 men and 3,500 chariots. The plain of Anatolia rang with the sound of forges and the low thunder of hooves. Egypt answered in kind. Seti's son transformed his father's garrison at the Delta into a city, Ramesses, the House of Ramesses, part palace, part arsenal. Bronze was smelted day and night. New stables rose from the marshes. The Pharaoh's scribes counted 20,000 men in 4 divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, each with its own god, its own chariots, its own pride. Shurden mercenaries arrived from the sea, bringing their curved blades and reckless laughter. Nubian archers joined from the south, their feathers bright as the dawn they served. By the end of that year, the world's greatest armies were facing one another across a thin strip of land neither could truly hold. Between them lay Kadesh, still pretending neutrality, still counting its profits. Above them, the gods of both realms must have smiled, for even they seemed to enjoy a rivalry. Egypt's priests called Amun the maker of victory. The Hittites prayed to Teshub, lord of storms. Both gods had been invoked too often to refuse the summons. And so, while scribes tallied and armorers worked, a new chapter was already being written, one of dust, deceit, and survival. When people later carved its story in stone, they would speak of chariots and divine kings. But it began, as all empires begin, with letters sent and promises broken, with men who believed their names could outlast the centuries. They could not know that on the plains of Kadesh, the world they shared was nearing its limit. The boy who would one day call himself a god was born into the echo of conquest. By the time Ramesses came of age, Egypt's armies had marched north once more, but their victories were already fading in the dust. His father, Seti I, had retaken cities and reopened trade, yet each gain slipped away as quickly as it was won. What Ramesses inherited was not a collapsing empire, but a restless one, powerful, proud, and unsatisfied. He grew up in the military camps along the eastern frontier, where the scent of leather and bronze was stronger than incense. Soldiers spoke his name as a promise. Priests spoke it as a warning. From childhood, he watched how the kingdom's survival depended on men who could fight, build, and obey, and how quickly glory turned to rumor once the drums stopped. By 10, the boy had been named commander of chariots, more ceremony than command, but it marked him as heir to his father's design, an Egypt not content to defend, but to advance. He rode alongside Seti on the Libyan frontier, his small hands steady on the reins as the desert wind tore at his cloak. Even then, he studied the way war worked, not only the clash of bronze, but the fear that moved before it. The throne passed to him around 1279 BC, when he was no older than 25. The coronation at Thebes was a theatre of eternity. Amun's priests anointed his brow with oil, and the golden Kypresh crown caught the morning light like a blade. In the temple chants, he was already divine, son of Re, beloved of Mas'at, chosen of Amun. Yet even as the hymns rose around him, Ramesses knew that divinity had to be earned, not proclaimed. He inherited a kingdom rich in faith, but thin in patience. Egypt's nobles remembered the famine and confusion of Akhenaten's heresy. The army remembered the humiliation of losing Syria. His task was to restore both faith and fear, to make Egypt seem inevitable again. He began not with temples, but with cities. Thebes, sacred though it was, sat too far from the northern frontier. From the marshes of the delta, he ordered a new capital to rise. Pi Ramesses, the House of Ramesses. It was more than a city. It was a declaration. The foundations sank into mud still smelling of the sea. Bricks baked in the sun bore his name even before he wore the double crown. From its broad avenues came the sound of thousands of workers, their chants timed to the hammer's rhythm. Within a few years, the city gleamed like new copper. Warehouses brimmed with grain, stables with horses, foundries with bronze. Where his father had campaigned, Ramesses planned. Pir Ramesses was built for war, its avenues wide enough for chariots to gallop side by side, its gates large enough to release an army at dawn. On the river, shipyards turned out transports capable of ferrying men and supplies north faster than any pharaoh before him. Scribes recorded stockpiles in tones of reverence, 20,000 spears, 5,000 shields, 2,000 chariots. His father's veterans drilled the new levies under the eye of Nubian captains and Libyan archers. Mercenaries from the western seas, the Shurden, fierce and unpredictable, were recruited in exchange for land and plunder. Ramesses made no distinction between Egyptian and foreigner in his army. He valued skill above blood. Those who served him well ate from his table. Those who failed him were erased from his monuments. Diplomacy came next. From Hattusa, King Muwatalli sent envoys bearing gifts and letters sealed with the symbol of the storm god. Their words were courteous, their meaning sharp. They spoke of peace while reinforcing their hold on Kadesh and Amuru. Ramesses received them in the great hall of Pi Ramesses, where walls gleamed with scenes of divine triumph yet to occur. His reply was equally polite and equally false. The courtiers who heard it understood. War was only being postponed until the city and its king were ready. Meanwhile, he tested himself. In his second year on the throne, Ramesses led a campaign westward against the Libyan tribes. He rode in his own chariot, his bow bent until the strings sang, and returned with captives enough to fill the work gangs of his new capital. In the south, he quelled uprisings in Nubia, ensuring the gold mines stayed open. These victories were modest but well publicized. Temples at Abydos and Luxor filled with reliefs showing him smiting enemies that posed no true threat. Every blow carved into stone was practice for the war that mattered. At court, the atmosphere changed. Poets began to speak of Ramesses as the heir of Thutmose III, the reborn conqueror. Officials competed to outpraise one another, each inscription a promise of the glory to come. Even Amun's priests, careful guardians of the divine order, seemed willing to believe that this young pharaoh might restore Egypt's old dominion. Yet to the north, Muwatalli was watching. His spies reported the construction of Ramesses, the mobilization of chariots, the growing audacity of Egyptian patrols along the border. The Hittite king had fought his own brothers for the throne. He would not yield Syria without blood. Letters became colder, their phrasing less ceremonial. One message, written in Akkadian, ended without the usual blessing, a small omission, but diplomats knew what it meant. In the winter of 1275 BC, Bentashina of Amuru made his fatal decision. Once again, he defected, this time back to Egypt. He gambled that Ramesses' star was rising and that aligning with him would bring protection. Muwatalli saw treachery. Ramesses saw pretext. Within months, messengers galloped north with orders to prepare the army. 4 divisions were mustered, each 5,000 men strong, each named for a god, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Chariots were refitted with lighter frames, 2-horse teams trained for endurance rather than shock. Armorers in Thebes cast new arrowheads. Leatherworkers in Memphis stitched harnesses until their fingers bled. At Ramesses, the pharaoh presided over the inspection. Rows upon rows of soldiers filled the parade ground, bronze glinting in the light. The air rang with the bray of trumpets, the drumbeat of discipline. Ramesses rode past them in his chariot, the blue war crown catching the sun, his expression calm, almost serene. Behind him, standards fluttered, falcons, jackals, suns. To the watching officers, it must have felt like the world itself had begun to turn again. He addressed them not as subjects, but as comrades. His voice carried over the din. We have been too long patient. The North remembers our silence. We will remind it of our voice. The soldiers roared approval. For the first time in generations, Egypt's army was marching north not to recover, but to conquer. That spring, couriers rode ahead through the passes of Canaan. The roads that had once carried tribute would soon carry war. Scouts charted wells and fords, mapped valleys, marked towns loyal and disloyal alike. Every stage of the journey was calculated. Gaza by the 3rd day, Megiddo by the 10th, Yenoam by the 15th. The campaign's precision would later be praised as divine foresight, but it was the work of human obsession. In Ramesses, the artisans set to work on commemorative scarabs before the army even departed. They showed the king standing alone, bow drawn, enemies collapsing before him. Fact and prophecy became indistinguishable. The myth of Ramesses the Great was already being minted. When he left the city at the head of his army, the wind off the delta carried dust and omen alike. Behind him, priests poured libations to Amun. Before him stretched the road to Kadesh, a road that had seen countless kings pass and countless empires fade. But none had yet carried such certainty in their step. Ramesses did not march merely to reclaim what his father had lost. He marched to prove that Egypt's gods still ruled, that time itself could be forced to turn backward. On that promise rested the fate of the 2 lands, and perhaps of the world beyond. Dawn came pale and hard over the northern frontier. The sands near Gaza glowed pink before the sun itself appeared, the kind of light that makes men think of omens. On that morning, the armies of Egypt began to move. Chariots rolled first, their wheels biting into the packed road. Behind them came ranks of infantry, shields catching the dawn. From the high walls of Ramesses, priests lifted their hands in blessing, and the pharaoh's banners turned toward the rising sun. It was a march not of conquest yet, but of intent. Ramesses rode at the head of the Amun division, his horses prancing restlessly beneath gilded harness. The air smelled of bronze and oil, and of dust not yet raised. Each man carried within him a rumor of what waited to the north. The city of Kadesh, the betrayal of Amuru, and a Hittite army said to stretch beyond sight. The betrayal had not been sudden. Bentashina of Amuru had long balanced his allegiance between the two great powers, swearing to Egypt when tribute came from Thebes, and to Hatti when the gifts arrived from Hattusa. But in the 4th year of Ramesses' reign, he made his choice. He sealed a treaty with Muwatalli of the Hittites, taking a princess of that northern house as his wife. It was a gesture meant to secure his kingdom's safety. Instead, it lit the fuse. At the Hittite court, the news was received with satisfaction. Muwatalli had been waiting for Egypt to react. He was not a king of noise, but of planning. In the cold halls of his capital, Hattusa, he gathered his advisors and began assembling the most formidable host his empire had ever fielded. From every vassal state came warriors, 16 kingdoms in all. From Arzawa, 3,000, from Lucca, 1,500, from Massa and Kidzuwatna, 5,000 more. From Aleppo, Carchemish, Ugarit, and the lands between came tens of thousands. When the musters were complete, Muwatalli stood before an army of 37,000 men and 3,500 chariots. His campfires stretched like constellations across the Anatolian plain. To the south, Ramesses was gathering his own storm. The pharaoh's messengers rode the length of the Nile Valley, summoning veterans and new recruits alike. Nubian archers from the south, Libyan spearmen from the west, and Shurdan mercenaries from the sea joined the call. Egypt's 4 great divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, were reinforced until each stood 5,000 strong, with 500 chariots apiece. It was not merely a military force, but an argument in bronze. Egypt was still the equal of any empire on earth. In Ramesses, preparations filled every hour. Armorers pounded metal until the air rang like struck bells. Scribes counted rations and tallied names. Priests blessed weapons with words older than the written line. The great storehouses emptied, their grain and beer and dried fish loaded onto carts. Behind the army stretched a living city of attendants, servants, and beasts of burden, thousands who would never see battle, but without whom battle could not exist. Ramesses' spies had once been the envy of the Near East. His father, Seti, had maintained a network of merchants and informants, stretching from Byblos to Ugarit. But in this new campaign, haste and overconfidence had dulled that edge. Bedouin tribesmen brought messages from the north, their loyalty bought and sold by both sides. Ramesses trusted them more than he should have. It was the first small crack in the flawless design. Far ahead, Syria waited. The land was green that year. The barley stood tall in the fields, and the fig trees were heavy with fruit. But the people who lived among them felt the tension like heat before a storm. From Amuru to Tunip, rumors spread of 2 kings preparing for war. Traders whispered that the pharaoh had sworn to reclaim Kadesh or die before its gates. In Hatti's border towns, officials conscripted men who had never held a spear, promising glory and plunder in Egypt's ruins. The air itself seemed charged with waiting. Amuru's betrayal had cut deeply. Ramesses took it not as a political act, but as personal treason. In his letters, he called Bentashina the dog of Hatti, and swore vengeance so absolute that his own scribes hesitated to record it. Yet behind that fury lay calculation. The defection gave Egypt its justification, a war not of ambition, but of justice. It was the kind of story the gods preferred. At court, Ramesses' generals debated strategy. The veterans of Seti's campaigns urged caution. Secure Canaan first, establish supply lines, and advance slowly. The younger officers, many raised under Ramesses' command, pressed for boldness. The pharaoh listened in silence, his eyes on the maps unrolled before him. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "We will take Kadesh before Muwatalli knows we have left Egypt." It was not bravado, it was conviction. The decision settled the matter. By late spring, the first divisions were on the move. The army advanced north through Canaan, following the coast road past Gaza and Megiddo, then turning inland toward the hills. Villages along the route were required to supply food and water. Where loyalty wavered, garrisons were installed. Where defiance stirred, examples were made. The campaign moved not as a tide, but as a storm front, relentless and ordered. Behind the front lines, scribes recorded every milestone. Day 3, Gaza secured. Day 10, Megiddo reached without resistance. Day 15, Yanoam entered, the governor offering tribute and safe passage. By day 22, they reached the fertile Bekaa Valley, where the roads split toward Lebanon and the north. Scouts pressed ahead, charting the passes through the Eleutheros Valley that led toward Kadesh. In his tent each night, Ramesses studied reports by lamplight. He marked the names of cities still loyal, those wavering, those lost. The intelligence was fragmentary, but enough to reveal a pattern. Muwatalli was moving, though from where remained uncertain. Some said he had withdrawn to Aleppo. Others claimed he was already encamped near Kadesh. The contradictions suited Ramesses' hopes. He chose to believe the former. At the Hittite camp, plans took on the shape of a trap. Muwatalli intended to draw the pharaoh northward, away from his slower divisions, then strike when Egypt's forces were divided. His chariots, heavy, three-man machines built for crushing impact, waited beyond the bend of the Orontes, hidden by the hills and the thick forests near the ford of Shabtuna. Spies disguised as traders slipped south, carrying false reports that the Hittite king had retreated far beyond the battlefield. They found ready ears among Ramesses' Bedouin scouts. As the pharaoh's army approached the frontier, the air grew heavier, the nights colder. The men talked of home, of wives and harvests left behind. Around their fires, they told stories of the pharaoh's courage, half to reassure themselves. Each dawn brought new orders, new marches. Dust rose behind them like smoke. Ahead lay the river, the ford, and the city that had defied generations of kings. Among the officers, there was pride and unease in equal measure. The divisions of Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set were spread too far apart, 15 to 20 kilometers between each, connected only by couriers on exhausted horses. The formation allowed faster travel, but it was a gambler's strategy. If the Hittites struck before the army regrouped, disaster would follow. Ramesses knew this. He chose to risk it anyway. To hesitate was to invite weakness, and weakness was what his enemies expected. On the 30th day, the army reached the outskirts of Kadesh. The twin towers of its walls glowed red in the evening sun, their banners motionless in the windless air. Ramesses' scouts reported no sign of the enemy. The pharaoh's heart, if the inscriptions are to be believed, lifted at the sight. It seemed the gods had cleared his path. He gave the order to make camp. That night, in the glow of torches, the Amun division pitched its tents beside the Orontes. The sound of hammers and shovels carried through the darkness. Across the plain, frogs croaked in the reeds. Beyond them, unseen, 37,000 men waited in silence for the command that would ignite the battle. The storm had risen. It would break at Kadesh. The roads north were lined with dust and expectation. When Ramesses set out from Ramesses, his chariot wheels cut through the same earth that had borne the armies of Thutmose III a century before. The difference was ambition. Ramesses wasn't reclaiming, he was declaring. The gods, he told his court, would ride with him. And perhaps they did, though the gods are rarely consistent traveling companions. From the Delta to Gaza, the march took 3 days. Gaza, garrisoned and loyal, opened its gates with bread and garlands. Scribes recorded the offerings: 500 measures of barley, 2,000 jars of beer, 10 oxen for sacrifice. The priests of Amun blessed the road ahead, but even they looked uneasy when they saw the endless line of carts following the army. Thousands of pack animals, wheels groaning under bronze, grain, and water. A moving city, 30,000 souls strong. By the 10th day, they reached Megiddo, the city that had once broken the back of rebellion in an earlier age. Its walls bore scars of that ancient siege, but now the gates stood open. Ramesses accepted tribute beneath the old sycamores, the shadow of his father's campaigns still thick in the air. There he reviewed his divisions, Amun in the vanguard, Ra following a day's march behind, Ta another day beyond that, and Set trailing farthest south. 4 bodies of men stretched over 40 kilometers of road, a living chain that shimmered in the heat. Each dawn began with the same ritual. Trumpets sounded. The soldiers packed the night into bundles and loaded them onto carts. The charioteers checked their harnesses, whispering to the horses as if they were comrades. The infantry marched in lines, 5 men across, their bronze and linen flashing like river light. Between each division moved the quartermaster's caravans, 5,000 supply carts drawn by oxen and donkeys. Every day, those beasts consumed half their own burden in grain and water. Every night, the scribes recalculated how long the army could live off what it carried. The land turned greener as they moved north. By Yenoam, reached on the 15th day, vineyards climbed the slopes and fig trees shaded the roads. Farmers stood in silence as the army passed, eyes down, counting how many soldiers they might feed or hide if forced to choose. The pharaoh offered coin for grain, but behind the neat rows of tents, foragers still took what they needed. A campaign does not survive on mercy. On the 22nd day, they entered the Bekaa Valley. The heat broke, replaced by a damp wind from the mountains. They camped near the town of Kumidi, where the local governor presented himself barefoot, offering jars of honey and local maps scratched on bark. Ramesses rewarded him with a golden necklace and a promise that Egypt's favor was worth more than gold. The governor bowed low. His messengers rode off the next morning in both directions, one toward Kadesh, the other toward Aleppo. In Syria, loyalty was measured in distance. Through the Eleutheros Valley, the army climbed, following tracks older than empire. At night, when the campfires stretched for miles, travelers said it looked like a constellation fallen to earth. By the 30th day, they descended toward the Orontes plain. Ahead lay the land that had drawn pharaohs and conquerors for centuries, fertile, river-laced, and fiercely contested. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Muatali waited. Ramesses believed the gods had cleared the path. His spies had brought word that the Hittite king had withdrawn far to the north, to Aleppo, 200 kilometers away. The source of that intelligence was a pair of Bedouin riders captured near Shabtuna, a small ford south of Kadesh. They were brought before the pharaoh, their wrists bound, their eyes darting between the guards and the gilded chariot before them. "What have you seen?" Ramesses demanded. The older of the two bowed so low his forehead touched the dust. "O mighty lord, the chief of Hatti fears you. He has fled with his armies to the land of Caleb. There is none who will stand against Pharaoh. It was a story too perfect to doubt." Ramesses rewarded them with food and sent them away, their deceit hidden beneath gratitude. Later, his chroniclers would call them the two Shasu spies, men whose lie nearly unmade an empire. The next morning, the army crossed the ford at Shabtuna. The river ran shallow, but the banks were slick, and the carts bogged down in the mud. It took the entire day to move the vanguard across. Ramesses' impatience grew with the sinking sun. "If Muwatalli has fled," he told his officers, "then Kadesh is ours already." He pressed on with the Amun division, leaving Ra a day's march behind and Tar and Set still farther. It was a fatal generosity of distance. Between each division stretched empty road and faith in unbroken communication. Couriers galloped through the dust, carrying orders and reassurance. But the roads of Syria were full of listening ears. By evening, they reached the forests of Labwi, a tangle of oaks and cedars dense enough to hide an army. The men spoke softly there, uneasy in the green silence after weeks of open desert. Birds scattered as the chariots passed. Beyond the trees, the Orontes glittered like a blade. When they emerged, the twin mounds of Kadesh rose from the plain. Tel Nebimend, the city's ancient heart, flanked by the newer walls on the river bend. Between them, fields of barley shimmered in the last light. To Ramesses, it looked defenseless. He gave the order to camp on the western bank. Sappers dug ditches and raised ramparts from packed earth, placing shields atop the walls to catch the evening sun. In the camp's center, the royal pavilion rose, its poles carved with lotus and falcon motifs, the banner of Amun fluttering above. Around it spread rows of tents, their entrances marked by standards shaped like gods. The air smelled of sweat, wood smoke, and the river. Scouts rode out to survey the approaches. One returned at dusk with 2 prisoners, a pair of Hittite soldiers found lurking near the woods. They refused to speak until beaten, then confessed what the Shasu had concealed. Muwatalli, they said, was not in Aleppo at all. He was camped behind the hills northeast of Kadesh, with many countries with him as allies, more numerous than the sand. The words hit the pharaoh like a blow. His camp, half built and half defended, lay within reach of a hidden army 37,000 strong. His second division, Ra, was still a day's march away. Ptah and Set were beyond help. For a moment, the silence inside the royal tent was absolute. Then Ramesses stood, face hardening. "Send messengers south," he ordered. "Tell them to make haste. We will hold the ground until they come." Outside, the soldiers of Amun worked by torchlight, unaware that the hills concealed their enemy. Across the Orontes, the first fires of the Hittite camp flared faintly through the haze, too distant to read as threat, too near to ignore. Ramesses watched them until the wind shifted and the light flickered out. Beyond those dark ridges, Muwatalli's army was already in motion. Chariots were being harnessed, horses watered at the streams. The heavy machines, each carrying a driver, a shield-bearer, and a spearman, stood ready in silence. They would cross the river at dawn, strike the Ra division as it marched north, and roll onto the pharaoh's unprepared camp. The plan was precise, the timing perfect. But for now, on the plain of Kadesh, the night held still. Ramesses walked the perimeter before sleeping. The moon hung low, silvering the ramparts, the shields, the calm river. Somewhere beyond the trees, owls called and answered. He paused beside the shrine of Amun in the camp's center, placing his hand on the god's image. "You led me here," he murmured. "Now lead me out again." No priest recorded what answer, if any, came. At dawn, the wind changed. The horses grew restless, stamping and tossing their heads. From the east came a low rumble, first mistaken for thunder, then recognized for what it was, the sound of wheels. The march to Kadesh was over. The battle had begun. From behind the hills, the sun rose, sharp as a drawn sword, its glow scattering across the Orontes and the bronze it touched. In the Pharaoh's camp, trumpets called the morning watch, unaware that an army waited beyond sight. The air smelled of river mud and cedar smoke. Birds stirred in the trees that hid the enemy. It was, at first, just another morning of marching and order. Then came the riders. They burst from the north, 2 scouts barely clinging to their horses, shouting before they were close enough to be heard. The sentries waved them through the ramparts. One fell at Ramesses' feet, dust-caked and bleeding. "They are here, my lord," he gasped. "The fallen one of Hatti is not in Caleb. He is behind the mound, with many countries beside him." The words were still echoing when the first tremor reached the camp. A low thunder rolled from the northeast, rhythmic, heavy, unmistakable. Not weather, wheels. From behind the rise of Tel Nebi-Mend, the Hittite chariots came, hundreds at first, then thousands, their banners flashing in the early light. Muatali's entire host had been hidden there all along, waiting for the Egyptian vanguard to settle, to believe itself secure. Now it moved like an uncoiling serpent. Dust rose in great curtains behind the charging line, blotting out the hills. Each chariot carried 3 men, a driver, a spearman, and a shield-bearer, all armored in bronze scales that gleamed like fish skin. They crossed the Orontes at the ford of Shabtuna in perfect formation, the horses' hooves throwing spray. Within moments, 18 squadrons, 2,000 chariots were on the plain. The Hittite horns sounded once, deep and long. The attack had begun. South of the camp, the Ra division was on the march, unaware of what was coming. The men moved in columns stretched thin across the road, weapons slung, the morning heat rising around them. Some were singing. Then the noise reached them, thunder behind the trees, and before any command could be given, the chariots were upon them. The first wave struck with a force that shattered thought. The ground shook. The air filled with the shriek of horses and splintering wood. Bronze blades cut through linen armor. Wheels crushed men into dust. The Ra division broke almost at once. Its commander, Amenemheb, was thrown from his chariot and killed before he could draw his blade. His deputy, Amenemope, was taken alive. His standard-bearer, Sayamun, dropped the banner of Ra and fled into the river reeds. In half an hour, 2,000 Egyptians were dead. 500 chariots lay overturned or burning. The survivors ran north toward the Pharaoh's camp, pursued by the triumphant roar of the Hittites. Inside the camp of Amun, the confusion spread like fire. The first fleeing soldiers appeared at the perimeter shouting, "They come! The host of Hatti is upon us." Officers tried to rally them, but panic is quicker than discipline. Some men grabbed their shields, others ran for the ford. Trumpets blared from the royal pavilion, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. Ramesses stood at the center, still armored from the night before, his face set in disbelief that so perfect a march could dissolve so quickly. He ordered the chariot line formed, but his voice was almost drowned by the uproar. To the east, the dust cloud was already rising, a wall of moving bronze and horseflesh bearing down upon the camp. Within moments, the Hittite vanguard smashed into the outer defenses. The palisades splintered. Tents went up in flame. The Pharaoh's guards met them at the embankment, loosing arrows until their quivers were empty. The air filled with a sound like tearing cloth. The shriek of chariot axles grinding against wood and bone. Hittite warriors leapt from their vehicles, swords flashing. The Egyptians fell back toward the shrine of Amun in the camp's heart. Somewhere in the chaos, a cry rose above the din. 2 men were dragged before Ramesses, captured Hittite scouts, bound and bleeding. Under torture, they confirmed the full scale of the ambush. Our master, Muwatalli, is here with the host of Hatti. Many lands with him, more than the sand of the riverbanks. So the truth stood naked. The pharaoh was alone with a single division, surrounded by the greatest army the north had ever gathered. He sent runners south with orders for Ra's remnants to rally, for Tar and Set to march without rest. Few would reach them. The roads behind were clogged with fugitives, carts, and wounded men. The divisions were too far apart, 40 kilometers of empty space between salvation and disaster. In the camp, Ramesses' officers urged retreat across the river. "We can regroup beyond the ford," one shouted, "and strike again." But the pharaoh shook his head. "If I flee," he said, "Egypt falls with me." He climbed into his chariot. His driver, Mena, took the reins. His shield-bearer followed. Around them, the guards of Amun formed a rough circle, shields overlapping, horses snorting in terror. The sun was climbing now, turning the dust into gold. Through it, the Hittite line advanced again, ranks upon ranks of chariots, their drivers grinning beneath bronze masks. The ground trembled as they charged. The pharaoh's camp became a furnace. Chariots crashed through tents and supply wagons. Oxen stampeded, dragging carts through lines of men. The noise was ceaseless. Shouts, screams, the clang of metal, the whistle of arrows. Amid the chaos, some Hittite crews stopped to plunder. They found the royal pavilion, heavy with treasure, and fell to looting. Coins, gold vessels, even Pharaoh's furniture. Discipline dissolved into greed, and in that moment, Ramesses saw his chance. He turned to his shield-bearer. "Mena," he said, "we ride." What followed would become the centerpiece of Egyptian legend. Ramesses drove straight into the thick of the enemy. His horses, Victory in Thebes and Beloved of Amun, reared and plunged as he loosed arrows from the chariot's moving platform. The composite bow hummed in his hands. Hittite warriors fell beneath its hail. Each time he wheeled the chariot, the line broke around him. It was not a battle, but a whirlwind, the pharaoh at its heart. Still, for all the courage and spectacle, the truth was narrower. Desperation, not divinity, drove him. His men rallied to his madness. The remnants of the Ra division, shamed and bleeding, returned to the fight. Together they formed a wedge, pushing the Hittites back toward the riverbank. The field became a churn of blood and mud, the air thick with the stink of sweat and iron. By mid-afternoon, the first assault had failed. Muwatalli's chariots, having broken through the camp, now found themselves surrounded by debris and confusion. Their formation shattered against the very spoils they had tried to seize. Egyptian infantry closed in with curved Kadesh blades, dragging Hittite soldiers from their vehicles, killing them in hand-to-hand combat. The sound was intimate, terrible, the world reduced to breath and blade. Across the river, on the heights near Kadesh, Muwatalli watched. Around him stood the allied princes of his vassal states, Azawa, Carchemish, Ugarit, all waiting for his command. The Hittite king hesitated. His initial victory had turned to uncertainty. The pharaoh still fought, and more Egyptians were arriving from the south. Muwatalli sent for reinforcements, ordering another wave of chariots forward. But the day was already turning. By sunset, the plain was a ruin. The Ra division was half destroyed, the Amun division bloodied but unbroken, the camp a tangle of corpses and crushed wagons. Smoke drifted over the river. The Hittite assault had failed to kill the pharaoh, but it had gutted his army. Ramesses stood at the center of it all, armor dented, face streaked with dust, his expression unreadable. That night, the survivors buried the dead and gathered weapons from the fallen. The fires burned low, the air stank of charred wood and fear. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the rest of Egypt's army was still marching, unaware that the battle they thought awaited them had already begun. By midday, the heat had thickened into something physical. It pressed down on men and beasts alike, clinging to armor and throat. The plains south of Kadesh shimmered with mirage, and in that wavering light, order began to melt. Along the road from Shabtuna, what remained of the Ra division staggered forward, not marching, but fleeing. Their column had dissolved hours earlier under the first Hittite charge, its ranks splintered and scattered across the fields. Soldiers who had sung at dawn were now running without weapons, their linen kilts torn, sandals lost in the dust. A few still clutched bows or spears, but most carried only fear. At their head rode fragments of the division's chariot corps, wheels splintered, horses bleeding from exhaustion. They shouted for direction, for water, for help. Behind them came the Hittites, relentless. The thunder of their pursuit grew louder with every heartbeat. From the distance, the camp of Amun looked like salvation. Banners visible above the earth ramparts, fires smoking from the morning meal. The survivors cried out, believing themselves safe. None realized that the camp was already under siege. Inside those ramparts, Ramesses was fighting to hold the line. His guards had driven the first Hittite wave back toward the broken gates, but fresh chariots were crossing the river. The ground trembled as they came on, the sound mingling with the screams of men trampled under hooves. Amid the din, the pharaoh's officers shouted orders that vanished into chaos. Then the remnants of the Ra division appeared, bursting through the southern approaches like a flood of ghosts. Their arrival brought no reinforcement, only confusion. In the press of men and carts, the camp's fragile defenses collapsed again. Hittite warriors surged through the breaches, their spears glittering in the sun. The scene that followed would later be carved into temple walls, though stone could never capture its noise. Men shouted names lost beneath the clash of bronze. Horses screamed as they fell, entangled in reins. Oxen stampeded, dragging wagons through lines of infantry. Tents burned where jars of oil overturned, smoke turning the air bitter. From the royal pavilion, Ramesses watched his army disintegrate a second time. Around him, the world seemed to narrow. To the pulse in his ears, the movement of Mena's hands on the reins, the glint of a spear tip aimed at his heart. He drew his bow and loosed without thinking. The arrow struck true. Somewhere in the maelstrom, a man fell, and the pharaoh's breath steadied. Beyond the camp, the ford at Ribla was choked with wreckage. The Ra division's retreat had carried them straight into the path of the advancing Hittites. Chariots collided in the shallow water, wheels locking, axles splintering. Horses plunged and drowned beneath the press. The Orontes itself ran brown with silt and blood. A papyrus later found in Thebes, written by a scribe who survived the battle, tried to describe it. They abandoned their bows, their spears, their sandals. The field was covered with bronze like reeds after a flood. No line of scripture could better summarize the rout. The Hittite chariots pushed forward through the confusion, cutting deep into the fleeing Egyptians. Their heavy axles and triple crews gave them weight enough to crush any obstacle. Wherever they passed, the ground turned to ruin. Yet victory made them careless. Drunk on success, some broke formation to loot the camp. They found the Pharaoh's pavilion, its chests still open, the treasures within unguarded. They stopped to plunder. Gold cups, inlaid furniture, even the royal canopy itself. In those minutes of greed, the rhythm of the battle shifted again. To the south, faint but growing, came the sound of horns. It was the Ramesses survivors, regrouping at last, urged forward by desperate officers. Their standards were gone, their numbers halved, but rage gave them coherence. Behind them, a handful of chariots from the Tar division had pushed hard through the dust, answering the Pharaoh's summons. The reinforcements were not enough to win, but they were enough to keep Egypt alive. Ramesses saw the opportunity. He rallied his remaining guards, mounted his chariot, and pointed toward the heart of the chaos. "Follow me," he shouted, his voice raw. "The coward dies running, the brave die remembered." They charged straight into the storm. The Pharaoh's chariot cut through fire and smoke, the horses plunging where others balked. Arrows flashed around him, but his bow sang faster. The Hittite plunderers, caught off guard, turned to meet him. Too late. The counterattack drove them back toward the ford, their own wagons blocking retreat. At that moment, the heat broke. Clouds gathered above the Orontes, dimming the sunlight. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and ash. Egyptian charioteers rallied to the Pharaoh's banner, their voices rising in a single cry that even the Hittites must have heard. For the first time that day, momentum changed hands. Still, the cost was staggering. 2,000 Egyptians lay dead on the field. 500 chariots were lost beyond repair. The Amun division had been reduced to a third of its strength. The sacred standards of Ra were gone. Ramesses' victory, if it could be called that, was survival. As the fighting ebbed, the pharaoh dismounted and walked among the wreckage. The ground was slick, the bodies indistinguishable beneath dust and blood. Nearby, Mena stood holding the reins of the royal chariot, the horses trembling and foam-flecked. "We are alone, my good lord," he said quietly. "The army is gone." Ramesses looked at him and answered, "Then Egypt will stand on what remains." Behind them, the fires of the camp burned low. The evening wind carried the smell of death across the plain. In the distance, the Hittite horns sounded again, not pursuit, but rallying cries, calling their warriors back to regroup. The first assault had spent itself. Both armies, bruised and staggering, withdrew into the failing light to count their dead. That night, the rain came. It fell softly at first, turning the ash to mud. Soldiers gathered beneath scraps of canvas or lay in silence, too exhausted to speak. Somewhere to the south, the torches of the approaching Tar division flickered faintly through the storm. Reinforcements, yes, but too late to undo the day's ruin. Ramesses did not sleep. He sat beneath the royal banner, staring at the soaked earth, listening to the slow drip of water from the tent poles. Every now and then, a distant horse screamed, or a dying man called for his mother. The sounds mingled with the rain until they were indistinguishable. When dawn came, the plain was grey and silent. Smoke curled upward from the wreckage of chariots, from bodies burned to prevent disease. The river ran high, sweeping away the dead. Among the survivors, the talk was not of victory or defeat, but of endurance. They had lived through the impossible, and that was enough, for now. Far to the north, On the slopes above the river, the Hittite banners stirred in the wind. Muwatalli's camp was still there, intact, watching. His chariots had bloodied Egypt, but not broken her. His prize, Ramesses himself, had slipped through his grasp. Between them lay the field of Kadesh, silent for the moment, but haunted by the memory of wheels. The Pharaoh's survival was a miracle, but miracles are only preludes to reckoning. The storm had not passed. It had only paused to draw breath. When the rain ended, the silence it left behind was almost holy. The plain of Kadesh steamed under the early light, and the air smelled of wet dust and ash. Across the river, the Hittite camp began to stir. Faint horns, the crack of whips, the grinding of wheels. To the Egyptians, those sounds were a promise. The storm would return. Ramesses rose before dawn. He had slept in armor, too wary to dream. His tent walls were streaked with mud. His hair smelled of smoke. Outside, men stood with the horses, their hides slick and dark. The pharaoh ran a hand along Victory in Thebes' neck and felt the tremor beneath the skin. The beasts were spent, but so was he. There would be no retreat. Scouts brought reports of movement upriver. Muwatalli's chariots gathering again, heavier than before. The pharaoh listened without speaking. He knew the rhythm by now, the sound of men harnessing vengeance. Around him, the survivors of the Amun division prepared in silence, replacing broken spearheads, tightening bowstrings, cleaning blades. No one asked for orders. They understood that everything that remained of Egypt stood within sight of the enemy. Ramesses walked among them. The soldiers looked up, their faces streaked with dirt, their eyes hollow but steady. "You are not alone," he told them. "As long as you draw breath, Egypt breathes with you." It was not a speech for history, just a statement to fill the space where fear might grow. The sun climbed, burning away the mist. From the north came movement, a shimmer first, then the unmistakable dust cloud of an advancing army. Muwatalli had regrouped and was sending his second wave. Bronze caught the light in flashes, and the low rumble of hooves reached across the plain. Ramesses mounted his chariot. His shield-bearer Mena climbed beside him, reins in one hand, axe in the other. "They are many," Mena said. "They always are," Ramesses replied. When the Hittite line broke from the haze, the sight was terrible and magnificent. Thousands of chariots spread across the plain, their banners painted with the sigils of a dozen kingdoms: Carchemish, Arzawa, Lucca, Aleppo. They advanced in waves, 18 squadrons of 150 chariots each, the sound of their approach shaking the teeth in men's jaws. The pharaoh's army, what was left of it, waited in a shallow crescent, chariots in front, infantry behind. The mud beneath their feet was still red from the day before. Somewhere to the south, faint columns of dust hinted that the Tar division was still on the march. But distance meant nothing now. Everything would be decided before they arrived. The first wave of Hittites hit like thunder. Arrows filled the air, slamming into shields and horses. Egyptian chariots wheeled to meet them, their lighter frames darting between the heavier enemy vehicles. It was not formation, but instinct, 100 separate duels unfolding at once. Ramesses drove straight into the melee. His horses lunged forward, hooves striking sparks from the stones. The chariot's axle screamed, the bow in his hands bent until the string sang like a lyre. Arrows flew so fast that they blurred, striking men before they could raise their shields. Later inscriptions would call it divine possession, but in truth it was the cold clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. He fought not as a god, but as the only thing the gods still recognized. a will that refused to yield. 8 times he charged into the Hittite line, each time deeper than before. Chroniclers would give names to those moments. The first charge breaking the warriors of Teher, the second scattering the men of Arzawa, the third cutting down the chiefs of Luka. Each enemy he felled became a line of scripture. But in the moment, it was only motion. Draw, release, turn, strike again. The chariot lurched beneath him, wheels spattering mud and blood alike. Mena steered through wreckage, guiding the horses by instinct. "To the right!" Ramesses shouted, loosing another arrow. A Hittite chariot overturned in their path. Mena swerved, missing it by inches. A spear grazed the pharaoh's arm. He did not flinch. When the dust cleared for a heartbeat, he saw the river glinting to his left, the field littered with bodies and broken wood. His own guards, the best of Amun, still fought around him, fewer with every pass. The ground beneath them was thick with corpses, Egyptian, Hittite, indistinguishable. Then came a moment of stillness. The Hittite front faltered. Among their ranks, confusion rippled. Too many vehicles crushed together, too little space to maneuver. The Egyptians, lighter and faster, turned that chaos against them. Ramesses shouted for his archers to aim for the drivers. Within minutes, the enemy line began to buckle. Horses screamed, throwing their riders. From his vantage near Kadesh, Muwatalli watched his chariots falter. Around him, the vassal princes argued. Some urged him to send in the reserve infantry, 8,000 fresh men waiting behind the hills. Others warned that the pharaoh's counterattack might be a feint. The Hittite king hesitated, then held back. He would not risk his reserves, not yet. That hesitation saved Egypt. Ramesses pressed his advantage. He wheeled his chariot again and again, driving wedges into the collapsing enemy formation. Each charge tore deeper into the mass of bronze and wood. The pharaoh's banner, blue and gold, flew high above the dust, a beacon for every soldier who could still move. In the midst of battle, a soldier near him shouted, "My lord, you are surrounded." Ramesses answered without looking back, "Then I am surrounded by victory." The words were reckless, perhaps apocryphal, but they captured the truth of that hour. Against every probability, the Hittite assault began to break. Those who survived the fight would later claim to have seen impossible things. Chariots moving faster than horses could run, arrows finding gaps in armor as if guided by gods. Whether the miracles were real or born of desperation no longer mattered. Faith itself had turned into a weapon. As the sun leaned west, the field fell into a strange quiet. The Hittite first wave was gone, scattered back across the river. The second stood hesitating, unwilling to cross the ground where so many of their comrades had fallen. Smoke from burning chariots drifted over the plain, turning the light to copper. Ramesses dismounted at last. His armor was dented, his bowstring frayed. Around him lay the remnants of Amun and Ra divisions, torn, blackened, breathing hard but unbroken. The pharaoh's hands trembled as he reached for water. Mena handed him a cup and said nothing. Nearby, the bodies of high-ranking Hittites were being stripped of their ornaments. Prince Gerbatusa, the king's own brother, Tarakenaz, commander of chariots, Agamas, keeper of the royal guard. Their names would later be carved in triumph. But in that moment, they were simply proof that the worst might be over. When evening came, the wind carried the smell of iron and rain. The soldiers gathered what arrows they could find and rebuilt their defenses. The wounded lay in rows by the riverbank, their groans rising with the night insects. Ramesses stood beside them, silent, his face unreadable in the torchlight. He had survived what should have been annihilation, but survival was not victory. Across the Orontes, Muatali's campfires burned uncounted. Egypt's army was scattered, its dead unburied, its king unbowed. In his tent that night, the pharaoh dictated a prayer to Amun, part plea, part defiance. "What is this, my father Amun? Has a father forgotten his son? Do I not walk and halt at your word?" Outside, lightning flickered on the horizon. The storm had not yet left the field of Kadesh. It only waited for dawn. Night passed without rest. The Egyptians held the plain in uneasy silence, the air heavy with the stench of fire and the murmur of the wounded. Beyond the Orontes, the Hittite campfires glimmered like stars scattered across the dark hills. Every man who saw them counted his breath, wondering whether dawn would bring another assault. Ramesses had not removed his armor. The bronze was dented and dark with blood, his cloak stiff with dust. He walked the camp before sunrise, passing the lines of men who had fought and lived, and now sat in silence beside the dead. In the distance, the river whispered, carrying fragments of wreckage, spears, arrows, and the bodies of horses drifting toward the sea. When the first light came, it revealed a field of ruin. Broken chariots lay overturned in the mud, wheels half buried, reins trailing like torn veins. The ground was scored with deep ruts where thousands of hooves had passed. The camp's palisade was gone, reduced to a few jagged stakes. The survivors of Amun and Ra divisions stood behind them, shields cracked, armor patched with cord. They had endured the worst and could endure little more. Across the river, the Hittite host began to move. Muatali's banners stirred, and a low, rolling drumbeat carried over the water. From his vantage on the high ground, the Hittite king could see that his first assault had failed to kill the pharaoh, but he still believed he could crush what remained. Behind him waited the allies of 16 kingdoms, their chariots reharnessed, their infantry ranks replenished. Ramesses watched from the edge of the ruined camp, his eyes fixed on the far bank. He could not know how many more enemies would come, only that they would. The ground between them and the river was already a graveyard. Another battle would turn it into ash. He ordered his men to tighten formation and prepare for a final defense. The camp was rebuilt in miniature, ramparts from debris, a shallow trench before the main line. Priests walked the ranks, marking foreheads with ash, murmuring the names of gods. No one believed the rituals would stop what was coming, but they performed them anyway. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared. Heat shimmered over the plain, and the air pulsed with the sound of insects. From the north came movement. First dust, then banners, then the glitter of bronze. The Hittites were advancing again, their chariots spread wide across the plain, infantry behind. The Egyptians braced themselves. They were fewer than half their morning strength, but their lines held straight. The pharaoh stood in his chariot at the center, the blue war crown on his head, his face calm in the sun's glare. When the first arrows hissed across the river, his expression did not change. The Hittites crossed at the shallows near Shabtuna, the same ford that had carried them to victory a day before. Horses screamed as they hit the bank, dragging the heavy chariots through the mud. The sound was enormous, wood, metal, and water colliding. Then, as if answering a signal, the entire formation surged forward. The plain disappeared under dust. The first wave struck the Egyptian line and splintered against it. Men fought knee-deep in mud, hacking at faces too close to miss. The Hittites had the advantage of numbers, the Egyptians of desperation. For an hour, neither side yielded. Then the sound changed. A new rhythm entered the field, sharper, faster, out of place. To the west, beyond the haze, horns were blowing, not the deep tones of Hittite bronze, but the higher pitch of Egyptian reed trumpets. Ramesses turned, scanning the horizon. At first it looked like a mirage, a column of men moving fast along the ridge, banners bright in the sun. The wind shifted and the symbols became clear. Egyptian standards, the falcon of Horus and the plumed disk of Ra. The narration had arrived. They came from the coast, veterans and Canaanite auxiliaries drawn from the port of Simira. Their commander, Amenemope, had marched day and night through the valleys to reach the field. 2,000 men, few compared to the mass of Hittites, but enough to change the air itself. The dust of their approach rolled down the slope like smoke from a new fire. Muwatalli's charioteers did not see them at first. They were too deep in pursuit, cutting through the Egyptian center, trying to reach the royal banner. When the first narration arrows fell among them, confusion spread like panic in a stable. Horses reared, drivers turned their chariots to face a threat they had not expected. The narration hit the Hittite left flank with precision born of exhaustion. Their formation was narrow, a spear point aimed directly into the side of the enemy line. The first volley of arrows tore through the unshielded crews. The second struck the horses. The impact was devastating. From his chariot, Ramesses saw the break. He raised his arm, signaling the counterattack. The remnants of Amun and Ra divisions surged forward, their shouts rising over the crash of bronze. For the first time since the campaign began, the battle's noise sounded like hope. On the far bank, Muwatalli saw it too. He ordered his reserves into motion, but too late. His allies from Arzawa and Masa, already shaken, began to falter. When the narration drove into them, they broke completely. The panic spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Men threw down their weapons, tripping over the bodies of their comrades as they ran for the river. The Orontes turned into chaos. Hundreds tried to cross at once. Horses plunged into the current, dragging chariots after them. The water boiled with struggling men, armor pulling them down. Later, Egyptian scribes would count 1,000 drowned, including a Hittite prince named Matrama. Whether the number was real or carved from pride, the river itself bore witness, its banks littered with wreckage for days. By late afternoon, the field was theirs. The narration linked with the Pharaohs' battered forces, forming a single, ragged line. The survivors looked across the plain where the Hittite host had stood that morning and saw only emptiness. The air hung still, heavy with dust and silence. Ramesses dismounted. His legs trembled when his boots met the ground. Around him, men were shouting victory, but he did not join them. He walked among the fallen, stepping over broken bows and shattered wheels. The field smelled of sweat, blood, and burnt cedar, the scent of the chariots that had burned in the last charge. Amenemope approached, saluting in the old Nubian manner, fist to chest. "We came as fast as we could," he said simply. The pharaoh nodded. "You came in time." That night, the camp was rebuilt for the third time. Fires burned along the riverbank, and the wounded were tended by torchlight. Priests offered libations to Amun and to the unknown gods of the narration. No one spoke of victory. They spoke of endurance, of having stood, of still standing. Beyond the river, the Hittite camp was silent. Muwatalli's losses had been severe, and his army too weary to try again. He sent his surviving allies back to their lands to recover. Egypt's army, too weak to pursue, held its ground and waited for dawn. When morning came, the two kings looked upon the same river from opposite banks. Between them drifted the remnants of what they had commanded. Wood, bodies, torn banners. No treaties were signed, no words exchanged. Only the slow retreat of noise, the kind that follows when men discover how narrow the margin is between glory and survival. Ramesses remained by the water until the last of the bodies had drifted past. The wind off the plain was cool, smelling of rain and smoke. He looked north, toward Kadesh's walls, still standing in defiance, and knew the city would not fall. The campaign had achieved neither conquest nor defeat. Yet for the pharaoh, whose legend would outlive the truth, survival was victory enough. That night, as the stars returned over the quiet river, the army slept at last. The narration rested beside the men they had saved, the fires of Egypt and Canaan burning side by side. For the first time in days, there were no horns, no shouting, no fear, only the low hum of insects and the sigh of wind through the reeds. The battle was not over, but its shape had changed. Both sides would wake to the same understanding, that no god had triumphed, only endurance. And in that uneasy silence between armies, the world exhaled, not peace, but the closest thing to it. Smoke lingered over the plain long after the fighting stopped. In the early light, it hung like gauze across the river, softening the outlines of corpses, turning armor dull. The Orontes carried away its dead without distinction, Egyptian, Hittite, mercenary, prince. Both banks were silent, save for the groan of wood as the currents pulled wreckage downstream. Ramesses stood on the water's edge, a silhouette against the haze. His armor had been cleaned, but blood had seeped into the seams and would not wash out. Behind him, the remnants of his army moved like ghosts, burying the fallen, tending the horses, collecting the arrows that could still be used. The camp was rebuilt one final time, not as fortress or stronghold, but as shelter for the living. The field was quiet now, yet no one called it peace. Every soldier knew the Hittites were still there, thousands of them across the river, still armed, still watching. Their campfires flickered through the mist at night like distant embers. The two armies, too broken to continue, simply stared at one another across the water, waiting for someone to make the first mistake. Among the Egyptians, talk of victory spread quickly. Scribes began to carve new versions of the day before, how the pharaoh had stood alone against legions, how Amun himself had guided his chariot. Men repeated those stories because they needed to believe them. Pride was the only rations left. To the north, Mu'atali's camp was steeped in its own silence. The Hittite king had lost more than men. His allies were shaken, their faith in his leadership cracked. The princes of Carchemish and Ugarit argued over whose troops had fled first. The lords of Lucca and Arzawa sent envoys begging permission to return home. Mu'atali listened to them with cold patience. He had not been defeated, but he had not won. A difference too thin to satisfy kings. He rode out at dusk to see the field for himself. The smell of rot clung to the wind. On the far bank, he could make out the Egyptian tents and the faint shimmer of bronze. Somewhere among them, the pharaoh he had meant to destroy was still alive, rebuilding his legend out of wreckage. Mu'atali turned away before the bitterness showed. That night, rain fell, again, harder than before. It flattened the fires and soaked the graves that had been dug too shallow. In Ramesses' camp, the water pooled in the footprints of men who would never walk again. Still, the scribes worked beneath makeshift awnings, ink running down the papyrus as they wrote. The king of Egypt smote the vile one of Hatti, his majesty standing alone, none beside him, words steadier than the truth. At the war council, Ramesses' commanders argued. Some pressed to cross the river and finish what they had begun, claiming the enemy was too weak to resist. Others urged retreat, warning that the army's strength was gone, that the men could not fight another day. The debate was long, bitter, and without resolution until the Pharaoh raised his hand. He spoke without anger, his voice rough from dust and sleeplessness. Egypt, he said, would not waste her sons chasing ghosts across the river. They would hold the field they had bled for, and from it, the world would believe what the temples would later tell. It was not cowardice. It was the recognition that the world could be conquered by story as surely as by sword. Muwatalli reached a similar conclusion. He had preserved his army, the heart of his empire. To throw it against the Egyptians again would serve no god. Instead, he ordered the wounded gathered, the dead burned, the banners mended. From his tent, a single messenger was sent toward the Pharaoh's camp under a white flag. He carried no treaty, only a message, that the war between great kings was finished for now, and that each would return to his land. Whether it was truce or fatigue that dictated the words, no one could say. The body of the river became neutral ground. For a day and a night, boats crossed back and forth, trading prisoners, returning captured horses, exchanging wine for water. Soldiers who had tried to kill each other hours before now met on the banks, staring with curiosity instead of hatred. Some exchanged small gifts, a ring, a belt buckle, a scrap of foreign cloth. The war had burned away everything but the simple recognition of survival. By the third morning, the rain had stopped. The air was clean again, and the plain smelled of wet grass instead of blood. The Egyptians began to dismantle their camp, loading what they could onto carts, burying what they could not carry. The horses were restless, the men quiet. They had not taken Kadesh, but they had not been destroyed either. That balance, thin as reed paper, would become Egypt's victory. Before leaving, Ramesses rode once more along the riverbank. The water shone red gold in the rising sun. Across it, the hills were empty, the Hittite camp withdrawn to higher ground. The Pharaoh watched for a long time, saying nothing. Perhaps he was listening for the sound of chariot wheels that would not come again. When he turned south, his army followed. The road home wound through the valleys they had conquered and lost in a single campaign. Villages stared as they passed, cautious, reverent, silent. The rumor of what had happened at Kadesh had already outpaced them. The story was changing with every retelling. Some said the Pharaoh had slaughtered the Hittites with his own hand. Others whispered he had escaped only by divine miracle. Ramesses made no effort to correct either version. In his silence, myth began to harden into truth. Behind them, the plain returned to stillness. The scorched earth sprouted new grass. The river washed its stones clean. The dead were claimed by time and by forgetting. Only the walls of Kadesh remained, dark and patient, their gates closed as if nothing had happened. The merchants resumed their trade, the fields were sown again, and the memory of kings faded into rumor. But under that calm surface, the border between empires stayed raw. In his later years, Muwatalli would tell his brother Hattusili that he had defeated the king of Egypt and burned the city of Appa, though even he could not make himself believe it. The pharaoh, for his part, carved his own version into stone. At Luxor, Abydos, Abu Simbel, and Karnak, reliefs rose showing him alone in a sea of enemies, chariot drawn by gods, victory eternal. The truth that both kings had survived and neither had triumphed was less useful than legend. The Orontes kept its secret. Its waters never told which side owned the day. For both kings, that was enough. The armies had stared across the river and seen themselves reflected, proud, wounded, unwilling to yield. The war had shown them what power could and could not do. When the last Egyptian banner vanished into the southern horizon, and the last Hittite horn fell silent behind the hills, the world seemed briefly still, a balance born not of peace, but of exhaustion. And so, the Battle of Kadesh ended as it began, not with conquest, but with endurance. 2 empires, 2 gods, and 1 river between them, each believing it had survived by divine favor, each knowing, somewhere beneath the triumphs carved in stone, that survival had been miracle enough. When the Pharaoh's army turned south, the land seemed changed. The same roads they had marched with pride now felt longer, quieter. Dust rose behind the columns of soldiers, thick and unending, blurring the difference between those who returned and those who had fallen. The wounded rode in carts or leaned on their comrades, their eyes blank from exhaustion. Chariots creaked, their wheels bound with rope where spokes had splintered. The banners of Amun and Ra fluttered in silence, their bright dyes dulled by blood and dust. Along the road, villagers came out to watch, cautious, reverent, unsure if this slow procession was victory or survival. Ramesses rode at its head, his armor newly polished, his expression unreadable. He had forbidden mourning on the march. "The gods have favored us," he told his officers, "and the world must see it." And so, the army moved as though triumphal, though every step was heavy. The first months of return were a blur of travel and ceremony. In each city along the route, governors and priests met him with gifts, garlands, cattle, jars of wine. They praised him as conqueror, though none dared ask how the battle had truly ended. To question Pharaoh's version was to challenge the order of the world. By the time they reached the gates of Ramesses, the story had already changed. News outran truth. Messengers had carried home the tale of a miraculous victory. The Pharaoh alone on the field, his enemies crushed by divine strength. Crowds gathered to greet him, chanting hymns of gratitude. The soldiers, hollow-eyed from the road, straightened their backs and smiled through fatigue. Ramesses itself had grown in his absence. The unfinished walls of its temples were now covered in reliefs of battles not yet fought, victories not yet won. The city was a monument in progress, half stone, half prophecy. As Ramesses entered, the priests of Amun stepped forward, lifting their hands to the sun. "He who conquers by the will of Re returns," they cried, their voices echoing off the colonnades. He dismounted before the great hall, removed his war crown, and handed it to his attendants. For a moment, the weight of it lingered on his brow. Then he smiled, not for himself, but for the story already taking shape. Within days, artists and scribes began their work. At Luxor, teams of stonemasons carved the first reliefs. The pharaoh standing tall in his chariot, bow drawn, surrounded by Hittite corpses. At Abydos and Karnak, similar scenes appeared. The same figures, the same divine light radiating from the same unshaken king. Each temple repeated the image until it became truth. The craftsmen worked from sketches provided by court scribes who had never seen battle. They copied the same lines from one wall to another. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of Amun, defeated the host of Hatti, none beside him. The repetition itself became a ritual, a way of remaking chaos into order. At Ramesses, the pharaoh commissioned a grand cycle of inscriptions, the most elaborate narrative ever carved in stone. It ran unbroken for 18 meters along the temple's outer wall, depicting the entire campaign from departure to triumph. The details were breathtaking: the glint of armor, the strain of horses, the chariots racing across the plain. In one panel, Ramesses alone stands against a wave of enemies, his arrows falling like divine judgment. In another, the god Amun leans down from the clouds, strengthening the king's arm. To reinforce the message, scribes prepared papyrus copies of the story, the poem of Pentor, and the bulletin of the battle. These were sent to every major temple, read aloud at festivals, copied in the schools of Thebes and Memphis. Young scribes learned to trace the hieroglyphs before they learned their own names. The tale became part of Egypt's memory, how Pharaoh had faced the entire world and prevailed. In time, even those who had fought at Kadesh began to repeat the story. It was easier than explaining the truth, that victory and defeat had been indistinguishable, that the gods had been silent. To survive was to agree with the legend. The soldiers told their children that they had stood beside Ramesses when Amun struck the Hittites with terror. In taverns, storytellers embroidered the tale further: the pharaoh's chariot flying above the ground, the enemy kings bowing before him. What had been endurance became epic. The court followed his example. High officials commissioned scarabs inscribed with the words, "The Day of Victory at Kadesh." They distributed them as gifts to nobles and priests. Each tiny token was a piece of propaganda, an empire's affirmation cast in miniature. More than 100 would one day be found buried from the Delta to Nubia, the physical echo of a story that refused to die. In Luxor, the pharaoh himself dedicated a new sanctuary to Amun, its reliefs depicting divine hands placing the blue war crown upon his head. The gods, once remote, had become characters in his biography. In their eyes, as carved in stone, he was both son and equal. Beyond the sanctuaries, the machinery of empire resumed. Grain taxes were collected, ships loaded with copper and timber once more departed for Byblos and Ugarit, and the scribes of the treasury recorded each shekel, as if the world had not trembled a season earlier. Only the soldiers carried the memory of that trembling, the scent of smoke, the cries in the dust, the moment when survival had been an act of will. They spoke of it only among themselves. Ramesses did not correct the record. He understood that truth mattered less than permanence. The gods might abandon men, but stone endured. If Egypt believed him invincible, then he would be. From his audience halls, envoys departed to neighboring courts bearing lavish gifts: silver, linen, lapis. To the Hittite king, none were sent, but messages of courtesy began to pass once more between them, careful and formal. In private, the pharaoh was not unmindful of the cost. His army had left thousands unburied beyond the Orontes. His treasury had emptied to equip them. But in the silence of his palace, surrounded by walls that proclaimed victory, he chose to believe his own myth. That belief, as much as his chariots or his gods, was the foundation of his reign. Years later, visitors to Ramesses would stand before the temple reliefs and marvel at the images. The god-king triumphant, his enemies crushed, his destiny assured. None could imagine the fear behind those scenes. The smoke, the chaos, the solitary figure in the chariot fighting not for conquest, but for survival. The story had consumed the truth, and in doing so, had achieved immortality. On the night the final inscription was completed, Ramesses walked the temple's perimeter alone. Torches flickered along the scaffolding, casting giant shadows across the wall. The carved figure of the king loomed above him, larger than life, unblemished, eternal. For a moment, He seemed to study his own likeness as though it belonged to another man. Then he nodded, satisfied, and turned away. Outside, the city of Ramesses lay quiet beneath the stars. The forges had cooled, the soldiers slept, the gods were at rest. The Pharaoh's victory was complete, not over the Hittites, not over Kadesh, but over time itself. The war was finished, but the story would last forever. In the north, the victory that Egypt carved in stone never reached the mountains intact. By the time word of the battle reached Hattusa, it had been retold a dozen different ways. Messengers from Carchemish claimed Muwatalli had destroyed the Pharaoh's army. Traders from Ugarit swore the opposite, that the Egyptians had crossed the Orontes like a flood and laid waste to Syria. In every version, the truth was thinner than rumor. The Hittite court received the news in silence. The capital's stone walls caught the wind coming off the plateau, and the banners above the citadel snapped in the cold. Hattusa had always been a city of discipline. Grey, watchful, fortified. Its people were used to distance, from the sea, from the desert, from certainty. In the great hall, Muwatalli's letter-bearers knelt before the royal council. They brought news of losses, thousands of men, hundreds of chariots, and, most dangerous of all, the fracturing of loyalty among the vassal states. Amurru had bled for Hatti and might turn again. Ugarit, hearing of Egypt's victory, hesitated to send its annual tribute. The empire's frontiers, once solid, began to ripple like cloth in the wind. King Muwatalli returned north by slow stages. The army limped through the passes, wagons heavy with wounded, and the bodies of officers wrapped in linen. Behind them, the cities of Syria smoldered, not destroyed, but unsettled, their rulers wary. He had preserved his throne, but not his reputation. For a man who had once commanded 37,000 soldiers, survival felt too much like retreat. When he entered Hattusa, the crowds cheered out of habit. Victory was the expected story. The king's silence afterward was not. For days he held no council, spoke to no envoy. His palace, carved from black basalt and cedar, remained shuttered. Only at night did the sound of footsteps echo through the upper halls. A man pacing, measuring, planning. Eventually, the court resumed its rituals. New oaths were sworn. New decrees issued. The king's scribes composed a proclamation declaring the battle at Kadesh a triumph ordained by the storm god. The king of Egypt came with deceit, it read, but my lord struck him and his armies fled. The words travelled south through the vassal states like a counterspell against Egyptian propaganda. Yet Muwatalli knew the weakness behind his own narrative. His army had fought bravely, but had not destroyed the pharaoh. The border remained contested, its cities unreliable. He turned to rebuilding, sending his brother Hattusili to command the northern provinces, a quiet exile disguised as trust. Hattusili's domain, the upper land, included the fortress of Hakpisa and the mountain valleys beyond. From there, he could watch the Assyrian frontier, where a new power was stirring. The Assyrians had grown bold. Their king, Adad-nirari, sent messages to the Hittite court, claiming dominion over lands that had once belonged to Mitanni. He demanded tribute, the ancient insult that means war in waiting. For Muwatalli, already burdened with the south, this new threat in the east was intolerable. He sent gifts instead of soldiers, gold, ivory, horses, the currency of delay. Hattusili's letters from the frontier were more blunt. The men of Assur move like a creeping sickness, he wrote. If left alone, they will consume what remains. But the king's attention stayed fixed on Syria. The Orontes Valley was still his line of pride, even if he could no longer hold it by sword. He began fortifying Carchemish, the hinge of his empire. Stonecutters and masons worked through winter to raise new walls 8 meters thick. Watchtowers crowned the parapets, their fires visible for miles. The garrison doubled, swelling to 5,000 men. In the city's temples, priests offered sacrifices to the storm god Teshub, asking that the next war be clean and brief. In Ugarit, the merchants watched the rebuilding with wary respect. They had lived too long on the edge of empires to trust permanence, but the sight of new walls was a comfort. The city sent tribute again, 1,000 shekels of gold instead of 500, to prove loyalty. On the tablets preserved in their archives, they recorded the change in cautious phrasing. The obligations of Ugarit to the great king have been renewed. Amuru, faithless as ever, benefited most from Egypt's indecision. Bentashina remained on his throne, rewarded by Muwatalli with new lands and a marriage into the royal family. His wife, Gasuwalia, a Hittite princess, arrived with a dowry of gold, silver, and grain. The alliance bound Amuru to Hatti more tightly than any chain could. From his seat between mountains and sea, Bentashina watched the border and sent reports of Egyptian movements to Carchemish. Every caravan, every patrol, every priest who whispered Pharaoh's name. In Thebes, Ramesses continued to proclaim victory. In Hattusa, Muwatalli did the same. Between them, the truth hardened into 2 incompatible stones. Each king claimed divine favor. Each built monuments to endurance. The soldiers who had actually fought at Kadesh were left with silence. Still, the Hittite machine endured. Muwatalli reorganized his armies, replacing lost chariot crews with younger men from the western provinces. He instituted new tribute systems to fund the rebuilding. Copper from Kizuwatna, timber from Luka, silver from the mountains of Arzawa. The empire became less a conquering power and more an intricate web of obligation, fragile but alive. In the royal archives, new scribes copied treaties onto clay, trade agreements, border pacts, alliances of convenience. The wax seals bore the same old emblem, the double-headed eagle of Hatti, but the tone had changed. These were not documents of domination, but of endurance. Through all this, Hattusili's star rose quietly. His letters from the north showed clarity, restraint, and a talent for holding unstable ground together. Soldiers under his command spoke of a leader who listened more than he shouted, who won loyalty by patience. Muwatalli saw both danger and necessity in him. Brothers are useful until they are rivals. In the spring of the following year, the Assyrians raided the Hittite frontier. Villages burned, cattle were taken, boundary stones overturned. The king sent orders north, but no reinforcements. The empire's heart lay in Syria now, and he would not weaken it. Hattusili fought on his own, repelling the invaders with what forces he had. In his victory report, he wrote simply, "The gods have favored the cautious." The words could have been aimed south as much as east. As the decade turned, both empires learned the art of stalemate. Egypt ruled its borders through monuments. Hatti ruled through memory and vigilance. The cities between them, Byblos, Amuru, Tunip, survived by duplicity, bowing to whichever sun rose first. At Carchemish, the new walls stood complete, their surfaces carved with symbols of divine guardianship. When the priests finished their prayers, they left the scaffolds in place. The stones would need to be raised again soon. Every Hittite knew that peace was only a season borrowed from the gods. And so, the empire waited. Its king still dreamed of recovering the south, but his letters grew shorter, his decrees more measured. The world was changing, slower than rumor, faster than tradition. The bronze glint of the old age was fading, and Muwatalli, though he could not know it, would be among its last true kings. The memory of Kadesh never faded, but it changed shape with every season. In Egypt, it became an anthem. In Hatti, a lesson. Between them stretched a frontier that refused to stay still, a thread of uneasy towns and dry valleys, where soldiers fought and merchants bargained in the same breath. For more than a decade after the battle, war did not end so much as dissolve. There were no grand campaigns, only movements of dust and rumor. Armies came and went, raising banners in the morning and vanishing by nightfall. The maps in both capitals shifted as easily as sand. Egypt struck first. In the 8th year of Ramesses' reign, his forces moved north again, swift and disciplined. The pharaoh himself led them, seeking to reassert his legend with fresh victories. The campaign reached as far as Dapur, a hill fortress overlooking the Orontes. The reliefs later carved in Luxor show the siege. Ladders pressed against high stone walls, archers kneeling in rhythm, the king drawn larger than his men. In truth, the fight lasted 3 days, the outcome uncertain. Dapur fell briefly, then rose again. For the soldiers who lived it, that year blurred into others, endless marches through the heat, raids against nameless villages, the same smell of sweat, fear, and rotting leather. They fought not for territory, but for illusion, to make the other side believe the border had moved. The Hittites responded in kind. Their generals struck at Egypt's allies along the coast, burning granaries, cutting trade roads, and disappearing before retaliation arrived. It was a war of patience, fought by men who measured victory in harvests denied rather than enemies slain. The gods received offerings for battles neither side truly won. Amuru, caught between, changed allegiance yet again. Its ruler, Bentashina, now bound to the Hittites by marriage, flirted with Egypt whenever convenient. His spies traded reports to both courts. His caravans carried letters in both directions. In that duplicity, he embodied the age, survival as diplomacy. Beyond Syria, new powers watched and waited. To the east, the Assyrians strengthened their grip on the upper Euphrates, forcing Muwatalli's successor to turn attention away from Egypt. The two great empires, bled and weary, could no longer afford full war. The frontier cooled not from peace, but from exhaustion. In Egypt, Ramesses' scribes recorded victories year after year, the subjugation of rebellious towns in Canaan, the reopening of old trade routes, the punishment of those who forgot their pharaoh. Yet the records were careful never to mention how quickly each city rebelled again, how narrow the line between triumph and repetition. By the 9th year, the pharaoh's armies were again in Syria, laying siege to Tunip. The city's walls held firm, its defenders supplied by allies from the Hittite north. The siege failed, though temple walls in Thebes later showed otherwise. Every setback was polished into success, every retreat reimagined as divine strategy. While Egypt carved its stories, the Hittites turned to rebuilding. The fortress at Carchemish grew into a citadel. Its markets thrived under heavy tribute. From there, caravans set out toward Ugarit and Amuru, carrying goods and spies alike. The northern provinces became a cordon of vigilance, neither conquered nor free, loyal only until the next famine. Trade itself suffered. Pirate bands from the Aegean began to roam the eastern sea, cutting into the lifelines that bound coast to empire. The merchants of Ugarit wrote anxious letters preserved on clay. The sea has become hostile. The ships do not return. With the sea routes broken, inland caravans grew rich and bandits richer still. Economies twisted under strain. In Ugarit's markets, silver tripled in price. In Egypt, grain stores ran low, forcing new levies on farmers. In the Hittite plateau, drought turned the fields to dust. People prayed for rain and cursed their kings. The great powers, still obsessed with each other, could not see the slow collapse creeping beneath their feet. By the 10th year of Ramesses' reign, another campaign marched north. It reached the city of Tunip once more and briefly occupied it, only to be driven back by a Hittite counteroffensive from Carchemish. Both sides declared victory. In Thebes, the Pharaoh's sculptors began new reliefs showing him seizing the city gates. In Hattusa, scribes recorded that the king of Egypt retreated before the might of Teshub. The distance between fact and inscription widened into myth. War had lost its rhythm. There were no grand battles, no decisive gestures, only attrition disguised as glory. Soldiers grew old, patrolling the same border forts their fathers had built. Children learned to sleep through the sound of distant drums. The world no longer expected resolution. In these years, a new figure rose quietly within Hattusili, the king's brother, now ruler of the northern provinces. He had defended the eastern frontier against Assyria and governed with steady pragmatism. His letters, preserved on clay, reveal a man weary of endless conflict. "Our granaries are empty," he wrote, "and the people tire of war that yields no bread." His tone was practical, his ambitions larger than they appeared. The pharaoh faced his own burdens. His empire still glittered, but the cost of constant campaigning strained Egypt's wealth. Temples demanded offerings, workers demanded grain. Even the gods seemed tired of being invoked for wars that resolved nothing. When the floods came late one year, priests muttered that Amun was reminding Egypt to look inward again. In the 11th year, pestilence swept the northern lands. Tablets from Ugarit speak of sickness among men and cattle. Hittite records mention a wasting of the people. Trade slowed to a crawl. Famine followed plague, and the price of barley rose beyond reach. The great powers, still locked in ritual hostility, found themselves equally powerless before weather and disease. By then, letters between the two courts had resumed, cautiously in the language of politeness. Requests for prisoner exchanges, messages of condolence, inquiries about grain shipments. Diplomacy, like warfare, became a ritual of endurance. The borders still shifted with every raid, but the tone had changed. Battles were smaller, treaties shorter, memories longer. The Bronze Age of conquest had begun to decay into something else. An age of negotiation, of fragments, of men too weary to dream of empire, but too proud to let it die. The scribes who chronicled these years struggled for meaning. Their accounts, half history, half lament, describe storms that ruined harvests, merchants ruined by piracy, priests lamenting the silence of the gods. Each nation still claimed divine favor, yet the heavens themselves seemed quiet. When a rare envoy from Hatti arrived in Thebes, bearing letters sealed in the double eagle emblem, the court received him with careful ceremony. Gifts were exchanged, gold from Egypt, silver from Hatti, as if each could buy back the decades they had lost. Behind the smiles, both sides knew that something deeper than their rivalry was ending. For the first time in living memory, neither empire had the strength to invade the other. Their armies still trained, their temples still sang, but the rhythm of ambition had slowed to fatigue. What had begun at Kadesh as thunder now settled into echo. In that long quiet, the world learned to live without victory. Farmers rebuilt their terraces, traders reopened the roads, and children grew up hearing stories of kings who had once moved the heavens. The truth, that those kings were now trapped by their own endurance remained unspoken. Even so, out of this weariness, the seeds of peace were sown. When the letters began to mention famine, and then relief, and finally trust, it was not diplomacy that changed the age, but exhaustion. Both courts, for the first time, wanted something lasting enough to outlive their kings. The war that had burned for decades was fading, not through will or divine mercy, but through necessity. The empires, too proud to bow to each other, bowed instead to time. After 2 decades of turmoil, the storm that haunted the Near East started to fade. It did not end with battle or conquest, but with ink pressed into clay. After years of hunger, plague, and border raids that changed nothing, both Egypt and Hatti had learned that endurance could no longer sustain them. In Thebes, the pharaoh was older now. The lines of his face had deepened, the gold of his crown grown heavier. He still spoke of glory, but the words fell softer. Ramesses had spent much of his life turning survival into legend. Now legend was asking for maintenance. Beyond his temples, the fields were tired, the people weary of taxes and conscription. Even the priests whispered that the gods might favor rest. Far to the north, Hattusili had taken the Hittite throne after the death of his brother Muwatalli. His ascent had not been smooth. He had deposed a nephew, fought rivals, and rebuilt a divided realm. Yet he was a man shaped by patience, colder than his brother, more calculating, more aware of limits. The empire he ruled was vast but brittle. The eastern frontier trembled under Assyrian pressure. The western coast demanded tribute he could no longer collect. The south, the border with Egypt, remained a scar he no longer wished to reopen. In the winter of 1260 BC, the first messages passed between the two courts. They were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic tongue of the age. Cautious, formal, every phrase wrapped in courtesy. The first spoke of goodwill, the second of shared enemies, the third of famine. Beneath the politeness ran a current of recognition. Both sides had come to the same conclusion. It took years to prepare what would later be called the Great Peace. Envoys traveled back and forth across the deserts, bearing tablets, gifts, and oaths. In Hattusa, the scribes worked beside furnaces, where the air smelled of metal and oil, pressing cuneiform wedges into wet clay with practiced care. In Thebes, papyrus scribes copied the same words in hieroglyphs meant for eternity. By the time the delegations met, the two kings had never seen each other, yet they understood each other completely. Their empires were mirror images, proud, aging, magnificent. Each could destroy the other, neither could afford to try. The treaty, as the final text would record, contained 18 articles. The first 3 declared perpetual peace between Egypt and Hatti, as between the sons of the same mother. The next 6 pledged mutual defense. If either was attacked by a third power, the other would send aid. The middle clauses guaranteed royal succession, promising to recognize the heirs of each kingdom, a safeguard against the assassins and conspiracies that haunted every court. Then came the practicalities, the extradition of fugitives, the treatment of refugees, the commitment to grant them life and protection once returned. In the end, the gods were invoked, not poetically, but as living witnesses to the words. 1,000 gods of the land of Hatti and 1,000 gods of the land of Egypt, the text read. Every major deity was named: Amun and Re, Teshub and Arina, Ishtar, Seth, and the sea itself. They were called to bless fidelity and curse deceit. To break the treaty was to invite plague, famine, and the destruction of dynasties. When the treaty was sealed, two versions were made, one in cuneiform for Hatti, one in hieroglyphs for Egypt. The Hittite copy was cast onto a sheet of silver, a tablet the size of a small shield, its surface engraved with twin images, Ramesses standing before the sun, god Re, and Hattusili before the storm, god Teshub. Each king was shown equal in stature, each extending a hand toward eternity. In Thebes, the Egyptian version was inscribed on temple walls. Its phrasing was nearly identical, though the tone leaned subtly in Pharaoh's favor. Egyptian scribes wrote that the great king of Hatti came to beg for peace, while the Hittite text described the agreement as mutual. Both were true in their own language, each reflecting the pride of its author. The negotiations had not been easy. It took 3 journeys by Egypt's vizier, Parsa, to finalize the details. He traveled with caravans heavy with gifts, gold, lapis, fine linen, crossing deserts where the sun bleached bone and memory alike. At Hattusa, he met the Hittite envoys Tili Teshub and the interpreter Hali Kalbani, who labored for months to bridge every word, every nuance. In those sessions, language itself became diplomacy. To describe brotherhood in Akkadian carried different weight than in Egyptian. To name a god wrong was to risk offense. Every phrase was tested against pride. Every sentence weighed against centuries of blood. The resulting document was as much poetry as law. When the copies were exchanged, ceremony followed. At Ramesses, the Egyptian court gathered in the great hall, where columns carved with scenes of victory now looked down upon an act of peace. The silver tablet gleamed under torchlight as priests invoked Amun's blessing. Ramesses raised it for all to see, the symbol of an empire that had survived by the grace of endurance. In Hattusa, the same ritual unfolded under the grey skies of Anatolia. The storm god was honored with sacrifices. Wine was poured upon the new stone of the citadel. For a brief moment, both kingdoms shared the same silence, the absence of war. The treaty's impact was immediate. Trade reopened along the Levantine coast. Caravans moved again through Byblos, Ugarit, and Amuru. Grain shipments resumed between Egypt and Anatolia, easing famine on both sides. Merchants carried news of the peace farther than any envoy could. To farmers and sailors, the names of the kings meant less than the simple fact that the roads were safe again. For the first time in generations, children born in Syria grew up without seeing armies march through their fields. The priests in both lands declared it the will of the gods, though the gods had never looked less involved. It was human fatigue, not divine mercy, that had wrought this quiet. The kings continued to rule for many years, but the age of their wars was over. Hattusili sent letters of friendship to Thebes. Ramesses replied with gifts. The words that once called for vengeance now spoke of trust. On one clay tablet, found later in the Hittite archives, Hattusili wrote, "The great king of Egypt is my brother. There is peace between us, and our sons will not raise the sword again." When the treaty reached its final form, both sides placed it under the protection of their gods. In Thebes, it was stored within the walls of Karnak. In Hattusa, within the archives beside the royal citadel. The versions differed in script and style, but their intent was the same. Each empire, exhausted by victory, had chosen survival. The bronze that had once armed them was turning to green with age. The scribes who wrote their histories were already comparing this new peace to myth. But unlike myth, this one was real. The first treaty the world would remember. No one would carve the word history into its stones for centuries, yet this was where it truly began. Among men who had learned that endurance outlasts pride, hardly had the ink dried on that treaty before messengers set out with a gift rarer than peace, warmth. Between Thebes and Hattusa, letters moved like gifts, each sealed with the emblems of kings who had once sworn to destroy each other. The tone was careful at first, then confident. In Akkadian, the language of diplomacy, they called one another brother. In practice, they were learning to mean it. From these letters grew an idea that neither empire had dared before, a marriage between their royal houses. For Hattusili, it was a chance to anchor the treaty in blood. For Ramesses, it was the perfect symbol of his reign, the union of two worlds once divided by war. The Hittite court sent word that the elder daughter of the great queen Puduhepa would be given to Pharaoh. Her name in her own tongue is lost, but the Egyptians called her Ma-Thorna-Ferua, she who beholds the beauty of Re. The new name was both blessing and transformation. In it, the princess became part of Egypt's divine order, her foreign gods folded quietly into Amun's household. Preparations began in both lands. From Hattusa, caravans departed laden with the dowry promised in the treaty. 1,000 talents of silver, 100 of gold, 10,000 bronze weapons, 300 horses with chariots trimmed in silver, and herds beyond counting. The procession moved south through Carchemish, Amuru, and Byblos, its route lined with onlookers who had never seen such a marriage between enemies. Every city it passed celebrated as if history itself had changed its mind. The journey lasted 3 months. Along the way, envoys recorded each stop, each offering, each omen. When the convoy reached the border forts of Canaan, Egyptian officials rode out to meet it, tall men in linen robes, their heads shaven smooth, their language rolling like the river they served. Between them and the Hittite guards, gifts were exchanged, lapis for papyrus, gold for silver, words for silence. At last, the bride reached Pir Ramesses. The new capital, once forged for war, had become a stage for peace. Its gates were draped in banners, its avenues lined with flowers cut from the delta marshes. Crowds gathered to see the arrival of the foreign princess, who would become Pharaoh's queen. She entered the city at dusk, veiled in gauze and jewels, her chariot wheels glittering with inlaid bronze. Behind her came the treasures of her house, the banners of her gods, the scent of cedar and myrrh. At the palace gates, Ramesses waited. Time had aged him into certainty, a ruler who had built monuments enough to outlast doubt. As she stepped down from her chariot, he offered his hand. For a moment, the noise of the crowd fell away. 2 dynasties, 2 empires, met in that small gesture. The marriage was celebrated with the precision of ceremony. Priests of both lands presided, their chants woven together in a language that belonged to neither. The princess was crowned with the uraeus serpent of queenship, her Hittite diadem placed upon an altar beside it, not discarded, only transformed. The feast lasted for days. Dancers from Memphis, musicians from Ugarit, food from every corner of the empires that had once burned one another's fields. Scribes recorded every moment. They described how the pharaoh called his bride the gift of Teshub and Amun together, how she spoke fluent Egyptian within months, how she walked the temple processions with poise and grace. In the city streets, people said she had brought luck with her. The floods rose high that year, the harvest rich. In Hattusa, Queen Puduhepa rejoiced. Her letters to Thebes were full of courtesy and wit. She wrote to Nefertari, Ramesses' first wife, addressing her as my sister in the lands of the gods. They exchanged gifts of perfume and jewelry, as well as advice on medicine and childbirth. The correspondence, preserved on clay and papyrus, glows with human familiarity. Queens discussing family, not policy. For both empires, this marriage was more than symbol. Trade blossomed in its wake. The route from Ugarit to the delta, filled with caravans carrying copper, cedar, horses, and wine. Egyptian grain fed Hittite towns during years of drought. Hittite metal replenished Egypt's armories and temple treasuries. Within 5 years, commerce along the coast tripled. The sea that had carried war now bore peace. At Ramesses, festivals marked the new era. The pharaoh built additional halls onto his palace, dedicated to the harmony of the two lands. Not Upper and Lower Egypt, but Egypt and Hatti. Reliefs showed him seated beside his queen beneath twin symbols. The sun disk of Re and the storm god's lightning bolt. It was the first time a foreign deity had been carved beside Egypt's own. Not everyone approved. Some priests grumbled that the purity of Amun's house was being diluted by foreign influence. Others whispered that Ramesses' faith had turned pragmatic. But the people loved the spectacle. The processions, the lavish temples, the stability it promised. For a generation that had grown up amid war, even the appearance of peace was sacred. 16 years later, in the 44th year of his reign, the pharaoh repeated the gesture. A second Hittite princess, younger sister to Mathorn Pharaoh, came to Egypt as another royal bride. Her name is lost entirely, her face unknown, but her presence sealed what remained of the alliance. The peace between the two empires had endured longer than any war they had fought. Letters continued between the queens. One, written in a flowing hand by Nefertari, survives in fragments. A message of affection to Puduhepa, praising her wisdom and her friendship. Another, from the Hittite queen, thanks Egypt for sending a physician to treat an illness in her court. Between the lines, a quiet respect grows. Two women maintaining the bond their husbands had begun. The prosperity that followed was real. Ports reopened, artisans thrived, and temples filled with offerings again. In Ugarit's warehouses, scribes recorded trade volumes 3 times greater than before the treaty. Ships from Cyprus and Crete once more anchored along the Syrian coast. The collapse of the old wars had given birth to a fleeting golden age. In Ramesses, the pharaoh grew old amid abundance. His city, now the jewel of the delta, glittered with palaces and gardens, its canals reflecting sunlight like polished metal. The queen from Hatti lived quietly within its walls, honored but apart, neither fully Egyptian nor foreign anymore. Her portraits, where they survive, show a serene woman beside a king who had long since turned himself into myth. When Ramesses walked the temple corridors, he passed scenes of his own youth. The chariot at Kadesh, the enemies crushed, the gods leaning close. Yet above those carvings, new inscriptions had begun to appear, not of battle, but of blessing. A king clasping hands with another king, a bridge of gold and silver joining their lands. In the evenings, the palace gardens filled with music. Foreign musicians played Hittite lyres. Egyptian flutes answered in kind. Servants carried trays of figs and wine. The pharaoh's grandchildren ran along the pools, chasing fireflies through the papyrus reeds. Peace, however fragile, had texture. Laughter, scent, and the sound of instruments played softly under torchlight. The union of two empires had not erased memory. Kadesh still stood in the minds of both peoples, its ghosts unforgotten. But the world that had once measured worth in conquest now measured it in endurance. For a brief, brilliant time, the heirs of those who had faced each other across the Orontes learned to share the same horizon. In that quiet between storms, the earth itself seemed to breathe easier. The peace between Egypt and Hatti held longer than anyone could have imagined. Long enough for Ramesses' sons to grow old, for new generations to forget the sound of chariots on the Orontes. For a single lifetime, the world seemed to rest. Caravans returned to the roads that had once been battlefields. Traders passed through Kadesh without glancing at its walls. The same city that had drawn kings into ruin now made its fortune in linen, cedar, and tin. Merchants from Cyprus and Crete anchored at Ugarit. Ships from Egypt brought grain and papyrus upriver. Along the coast, markets swelled with laughter and foreign tongues. Peace had become a habit, a rhythm men believed would last forever. In Egypt, Ramesses reached its zenith. The capital shone with courtyards of white limestone and pools that reflected the sky. The pharaoh, old now and surrounded by sons and grandsons, walked the avenues he had built in youth. The statues of his younger self looked down upon him, unwrinkled, unbending, unending. In those faces, time stood still. Ramesses had become legend long before he died. The walls of his temples told the story he had chosen. The warrior king who had faced the might of Hatti and prevailed by divine strength. His sculptors gave that image to eternity, carving it deep enough that even sand could not erase it. In every temple, the same scenes repeated. The king alone in his chariot, the enemy scattering, the gods at his back. Few remembered the river that had carried away his dead, or the treaties signed in exhaustion. To his people, he was not the survivor of Kadesh, but its conqueror. And perhaps that was victory enough. In the north, Hattusili ruled wisely, then passed his throne to his son Tudalia. The dynasty endured, its cities rebuilt in stone, its laws codified in tablets. For a time, the world seemed solid again, bound by commerce, faith, and shared prosperity. But even in the calmest seasons, fault lines run beneath the surface. By the middle of the 13th century, BC, the old balance began to fray. Across the Aegean, kingdoms rose and fell in rapid succession. Sea peoples, a name the scribes would later give to wanderers from many lands, began to appear along the coasts. Their ships struck without warning, their motives as fluid as the tides. Ugarit, once rich from peace, sent desperate letters for aid. The enemy ships are here. The cities burn. The king is away. No answer ever came. To the east, Assyria grew restless again, pressing into lands the Hittites could no longer defend. Trade faltered. Grain became precious. The roads that had once carried envoys and brides now filled with refugees. The great web that had connected the Bronze Age world began to unravel, thread by shining thread. In Hattusa, the archives grew silent. The last tablets speak of shortages, of prayers unanswered, of gods who no longer listened. Carchemish held out for a time. Then even its walls fell to dust. The empire of the storm god faded like mist over the mountains. Egypt endured longer, though even its splendor dimmed. After Ramesses, the line of his sons fractured under its own weight. Temples demanded offerings that could no longer be paid. Workers in Thebes went on strike for bread and beer. The monuments remained, vast, serene, untouched. But the faith that had built them began to crumble. The world of bronze, of kings and chariots, of letters written in clay, came quietly to an end. No single day marked its passing. It died as empires do, not in fire, but in forgetting. Still, traces of that age still breathe. In the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered the broken tablets of the Great Peace. Akkadian lines still clear after 3,000 years. One copy rests today in Istanbul, another replica in New York, displayed at the United Nations. The modern heirs to that ancient hope. The same words endure. There shall be peace and brotherhood between us forever. Across the deserts, the monuments of Egypt stand unbroken. The reliefs at Abu Simbel still catch the dawn, their carved faces lit by the same sun that shone on the Orontes. The inscriptions inside speak of divine victory, of gods who stood beside their chosen king. Tourists walk there now, reading the story Ramesses told about himself, unaware of how close he had once come to ruin. History remembers him as Ramesses the Great, builder, conqueror, immortal in stone. But behind that name stands the man who once looked across a river and saw his reflection in another king, proud, weary, unwilling to yield. Between them, they made the world's first peace. What they built could not survive the centuries, but its echo did. It endures in every pact signed between enemies, every flag lowered after battle, every word that tries to turn survival into meaning. The world that followed would be smaller, harsher, made of iron instead of bronze. Yet in that fading age, two kings discovered what conquest never could, that to endure is the highest art of power. As the last light fell on Ramesses, the old pharaoh watched the sky turn red over the delta. The wind carried the scent of the sea, and for a moment he thought he heard the distant hum of chariot wheels. Then the sound faded, leaving only the rustle of reeds. The empire he had shaped would outlive him, but even it would one day fall silent. Still, his name would remain, carved into cliffs, whispered by scholars, remembered in treaties long after the gods who blessed them were forgotten. The world changes, but memory clings to what endures. And somewhere in that memory, in the meeting of two weary kings, in a river that refused to choose a side, the Bronze Age ended as it began, with men trying to make peace before the world moved on without them.